Aha, yes, what we used to think about society. This should already be in your notes. It's what we're kind of, whoa, we're up to 7. Woo. This should be in your notes. It is what we're trying to kind of dislodge from our heads. And like I said, you may not believe that you believe this, but it's kind of deeply embedded in our society. And so I don't want to keep repeating it and thereby embed it further, but we just need to know what we used to think about how society worked. We began in a phase of man the hunter, then we transitioned to a phase of man the herder, and man the farmer, and then civilized man. And the idea has been that this whole sequence was the progression or the ascent of human beings, right? So that we kind of pulled ourselves out of savagery. We pulled ourselves out of being wild man, these wild creatures who were just running after wild animals. And in the process of domesticating plants and animals, the idea is that we domesticated ourselves and that we became civilized because of it. And I should mention here that the very word agriculture, notice that the word agriculture has the word culture included in it, which is to say that we once believed that this phase between when we become agricultural people is also when we became cultural people, and that people who didn't have agriculture were somehow pre-cultural or uncivilized or maybe uncultured or natural people, natural man. So we're trying to get away from this idea, but we have to kind of keep going over it to figure out what's wrong with it. In the last class, we focused on this man the hunter phase. We did those figurines, and we really tried to get out of the idea that that was a time that was dominated by man the hunter. And we wanted to talk about how that is a phase of hunting and gathering, which is a successful phase that people are able to spread out all over the world. Today, we're looking at the domestication of plants and animals. We're going to start with a very strange article by Jared Diamond, who is not an anthropologist, but has borrowed a lot from anthropology over the years. And Jared Diamond will be a kind of foil figure for the next couple classes. He's a very famous author, and this article actually kind of launched his popular science writing career, The Worst Mistake in the History of the Human Race. And basically, the thing about Diamond is what it did was, or what he was trying to do, was in a very polemical fashion, that is, in a very exaggerated way, kind of disrupt our thinking on this. Because as some of you mentioned in your web comments, like, wait a second, I never thought about it that way. I always thought that farming was better than hunting and gathering, that it was more productive. And so basically what Diamond is saying is that instead of this being an ascent to civilization, that it's a disaster. He calls it a catastrophe, that the whole idea that we have of agriculture being a benefit was actually the worst thing that we ever did. What he's drawing on here is, like I said, a school of thought that arose probably in the 1960s and 1970s, and they called themselves revisionists because they were trying to revise the predominant thinking, especially about these earlier stages of human history. So we're going to go into Diamond's revisionism for the first part of class, and then in the second part of class, we'll spend more time in our textbook. So, yes, I want to sort this out in terms of, again, we're going to be drawing from Diamond's article. Some of the things the claims that he makes are decently supported, and I'm going to be giving you kind of the best version that I can of this. And so basically what we're going to do is break it down between hunters and gatherers, comparing that with farming societies, as Diamond does, in terms of their diet, in terms of who has more disease, and in terms of their social structure. So let's see. In terms of the diet, actually, let's see. Emma, what was surprising about the hunter-gatherer diet as compared to the farmer diet?
They were talking about in the article how the gathering hunting people actually had a better diet than the farming one, because it consisted of like a lot more protein compared to the farming one, which is like more high carb stuff.
Okay, so in a hunting and gathering society, you may not have a lot of food, but you're going to be drawing on a whole bunch of diverse sources, have a lot of variety, and a surprising amount of, well, I guess perhaps not surprising if you're doing a decent amount of hunting, but a surprising amount of protein, and your foods are going to be have more nutrients in them. Whereas in the farming societies, and you know, a lot of people are into these paleo diets now, right? Because they want to get away from the farming diets. You're going to have an increase in carbohydrates and starchy foods often, and you often are only planting one crop. You're monocropping. You're starting to depend or kind of put all your, that's a kind of a funny word, put all your eggs in one basket. You're trying to plant a lot of one thing to increase the quantity of it, because that's what your goal is. And you know, one of the interesting things that Diamond and Levin and Schultz mention is that if we look back at the skeletons that we can have of some of these hunter-gatherers, oftentimes they're pretty tall, especially as compared to some of those, especially in Greece and Turkey, or if you compare the skeletons of hunter-gatherers with the people a couple hundred years later, when they've adopted agriculture, what happens, Aiden, to how tall they are? Oh, they've shrunk. Their heights have crashed, right? And we don't, you know, who knows why this is. It's not true all over the world, but oftentimes in parts of the world where you go from hunting and gathering to agriculture, people get shorter because they're not as nutritious. There might be more people, but they're all stunted. So Diamond makes the point that in fact, in some of these areas, they aren't even as tall as they were thousands of years ago on average. And in some ways, we can think of this as a proxy for health, right? And then something else interesting, you would usually associate, you know, being hungry and not having enough to eat with the hunters and gatherers. But what do we see, Dylan? What happens with the farmers? What happens when your crop fails?
When your crop fails, like you rely all on like the monocropping, so there's more chance of starvation because if the crop fails, you have nothing to eat.
Yeah, so again, I'm not trying to say as a hunter-gatherer is always sitting around feasting all the time. There are probably some lean periods for the hunters and gatherers, but you can move to different places, you can try different things. For farmers, they get dependent on one thing. You may have heard about some famines, like the Great Potato Famine, right? All the famines and the starvation that we see is not in hunting and gathering societies. It's in farming societies where there's some sort of political or economic or drought, and the one thing that they're depending upon fails, and that's where you get this kind of mass starvation that we've seen mostly in the last few hundred years or so. All right, disease. This is interesting. Perhaps it's interesting to us now because here we all are trying to spread out. And that was a great hunter-gatherer strategy, right? In some ways, because it wasn't that they didn't have diseases, there were diseases, but the populations are sparse. Less chance to spread them around. They were doing social distancing long before it was cool. So in some ways, disease has less spread among hunter and gatherer societies. In farming societies, there's a couple things that happen. One, they have domesticated animals, which many of our diseases come into us from our close association with animals. All kinds of bird flus and I'm not sure exactly, we have the name for chicken pox, but I'm not sure if that comes exactly from chickens, but there's often an association between living closely with animals and various forms of disease. Then if you have a concentrated population, those diseases tend to spread more rapidly. I guess I don't need to tell you about this because we're seeing it right here. One disease, though, that is also completely something that arises where agriculture arises is malaria. And it arises because people irrigate, mosquitoes breed, and malaria goes directly with agriculture. So in terms of disease, again, hunter-gatherers in general have kind of avoided some of the worst plagues and diseases that we see among agricultural peoples and among our own. Social structure, a few things here. In hunting and gathering societies, it's not that there's no distinction between people, but they're relatively egalitarian. That is to say, people are kind of, well, what happens, Francis? What's the difference between hunting and gathering and farming societies in terms of their social class?
The social structures, they kind of start at the grave, especially when they realize that like things have like all joint graves, but then they moved on and they had like separate ones because people were buried with gold and things like that. How much they depend on food because the ones that ate more food were taller and had better teeth. It all just kind of depended on that.
Okay, very good. And this is something we'll talk about in the next class as well, as the advent of social class and how you can tell that in the archaeological record based on what you're buried with, right? If you're a rich person, you're going to be buried with your stuff, and you can tell that, hey, people are able to store wealth, right? It's in a hunter and gatherer society, you can't really store wealth because the wealth is something that it's simply in wherever you're hunting and gathering. There's not much reason to have a bunch of gold around. You can't really do anything with it. Whereas in agricultural societies, you can store wealth and then you can buy things with it and it's durable. And so you're able to then accumulate more stuff. And so again, I'm not trying to say that hunter-gatherers are all equal all the time, but they have a relatively equal access to resources for everyone who's in the group. This is probably one of the most controversial and in some ways, well, it's not controversial. It's actually kind of a measurable fact, but it's hard to believe. And this was actually an anthropologist named Richard Lee. We'll read more from him later on. And he just sort of measured how much time it took in the hunting and gathering society to fulfill your basic needs, shelter, food, all these things. And he calculated that most people were able to do all this stuff, working together, of course, with about 12 to 20 hours of work per week. Now, if you think about what we're doing here, when we're like doing 12 to 20 hours of classes, and then you have to do additional work outside your class, you're like, whoa, wait a second. And so if you think about, what you have in terms of leisure time, farming societies where you have to be attentive to the plants and animals all the time tend to have a great deal more work than the average hunter-gatherer. Now, again, this depends. If you have a lot of gold, you may have a lot of leisure time. But in general, for the bulk of the population, you're having to work more. The 40-hour work week, you may have heard of it. As Diamond says, in hunter and gatherer societies, relative equality between the sexes. We talked about a little bit in the last class, the contribution of women in hunting and gathering societies, contributing 70% of the calories. Whereas in agricultural societies, women often become kind of the literal beasts of burden. They're ones that are carrying everything and doing all the work, tend to have more children, less spacing between the children because it's valuable to have more children. You want them in order to be able to do all the work. And so it generally leads to an inequality between the sexes or between the genders in agricultural societies. Something we'll talk about more in the next class, but I just want to mention here. In a hunter-gatherer society, there's not much need to defend a territory. And you can't really support an army that that trains for battle all the time, because everybody has to help out. And there you can't, again, you can't store wealth, and you can't sort of store your food for a long, long time. And so it makes it very difficult to support something like we would call an army. And so typically, if another group is coming in and they have more numbers or something, the hunter-gatherer group just goes to a different area. They don't have I mean, you certainly have like your own hunting territories, and you might defend those, but not in the way that you'd go in and wipe out whole villages or try to take over a territory. Whereas in agricultural societies, and again, we'll talk about this next week on Tuesday, you have, the formation of walls and boundaries and hold all kinds of war instruments in order to take over another person's place. So again, this is a revisionist perspective. It totally tries to turn ourselves around on what agriculture means and what it was in human development. Now, of course, the question arises, I'm sure you're asking yourself this, if this is so bad, if this is such a big mistake, then why did people do it, right? I mean, this is stupid, right? Why would you do something that is so terrible? So Diamond has an answer for us. Brooke, why?
Because it's like, it feeds more people, like farming is able to feed the population. Give up food from it.
You get more food from it. Yeah, according to Diamond, it really wasn't a mistake in the sense, we usually think of a mistake as something I did something and I could have done something else. According to Diamond, you didn't really have a choice. That there were population pressures, more people had to feed them. So what do? You start growing crops. And so in Diamond's world, you trade in quality of food, the high, diverse, nutritious food, for quantity. And so, you might have periodic starvation, but in general, you're able to produce more food and you can feed more people. And then the idea is that the people who got agriculture, because they were able to multiply and there's more of them, then they can drive out the hunter-gatherers. As Diamond puts it, it doesn't matter if you have a few very tall, healthy hunter-gatherers. If you're facing down 100 short people who are all mad and want to take your land, you can't hold out. And so you have to either adopt agriculture for yourself and try to grow your numbers, or you have to leave and go somewhere else. And then Diamond makes an additional argument, and it's something I think we should think about a little bit, is that what he's saying is that, sure, from our perspective, from the perspective of the United States, where you go down and you go to the refrigerator and you pop in a microwave meal and you're like, this is great. But he says that in general, across the world, and remember he's writing this in 1987, that agriculture hasn't delivered the great thing that it was supposed to do. And that in fact, if you look at a lot of the things we eat and drink, they come from places where people are working really hard to provide them and to export them. There's I don't want to make you stop drinking coffee, but if you read about the conditions of labor on the coffee plantations in Brazil, where most of our coffee comes from for Dunkin' Donuts, it's like, whoa, I don't want to read that because I just want to have my coffee in the morning and be happy, right? So the thing is that a lot of people are still laboring very hard and not really realizing the supposed benefits of agriculture, living on very low wages or not really at all. And so Diamond is asked, would you rather be an Ethiopian farmer or an Ethiopian hunter-gatherer? Then the choice is a little less different. Of course, you want to be up here at the top of things, but in the world perspective, you may not have that much. So it's meant to be provocative. It's meant to be a polemical article. That is, it exaggerates or it kind of takes a stand in order to dislodge a typical point of view, which was probably even more typical back in 1987 when it was written. I've assigned this article for many years, and for a long time, it used to just really piss people off. They'd be like, oh, I can't, diamond is so full of it. Agriculture is great. We put a man on the moon. What are you talking about, diamond? This is stupid. Nowadays, I don't know, maybe some of you were pissed off reading it, but I think maybe because of the paleo diet and all that stuff, people are like more like, oh yeah, that makes sense. Maybe it was a big mistake. Maybe this civilization stuff sucks. But anyway, it's meant to provoke us. It's meant to provoke a reaction or provoke a thought. Now, I want to show you about 15 minutes of the film version of a National Geographic special that was called Guns, Germs, and Steel. And Guns, Germs, and Steel, so 10 years after this article came out, The Worst Mistake in the History of the Human Race, Diamond published what is probably his best-selling book, won the Pulitzer Prize. It's called Guns, Germs, and Steel. It's about 800 pages long, so you're getting like the 15-minute version from me, so be happy. It's been a very popular book, and it is also about agriculture, but it takes a slightly different perspective. So why am I showing you this? I want you to look for a few things in here. One, what we're going to talk about is how certain plants and animals in certain areas of the world became what we call candidates for the domestication. They were domesticable. And so different people in different parts of the world were able to domesticate different plants and animals. And so you can think about, well, over time, when people are, especially when we're continentally separated, as say the Americas from Europe and Asia, what would be the long-term consequence of people who were able to domesticate different things? And then what's to me is also interesting about this is to compare the Jared Diamond of Guns, Germs, and Steel, and you'll get to see him here, with the kind of Jared Diamond that we just read from The Worst Mistake. It's a little slightly different.